much for having me tonight, folks. GB Energy is a policy that, given the significance it took on in Labour's general election campaign and manifesto, is criminally under discussed. It's scandalous that the party and their government have been able to talk so much about this policy without adding any or so little meat to the bone of what we're talking about, that even frontbench ministers struggle to describe what the policy actually does. You listen to Anna Sarwar and he'll tell you that GB Energy is a publicly owned energy company which is going to generate electricity. You listen to Pat McFadden, Labour's frontbench minister, and he'll tell you that GB Energy is in actual fact just an investment arm which is going to de-risk projects that the private sector refused to take on with public sector investment. So this project, at least if you listen to the politicians, has various different incarnates. And I guess what I'm going to try to do, hope to do this evening, is shift through the weeds a bit and work out what we do actually know about GB Energy and what it means for the just transition and what it means for Britain's energy transition, because it is critically important. GB Energy as an idea, Great British Energy, emerged in August 2022. August 2022 being the height of the strike wave. Labour were under immense pressure to come up with some more bold, transformative policy agenda, and Keir Starmer had just implemented his picket line ban, barring MPs from appearing on picket lines. He was undergoing a number of crises regarding that and other policy positions he'd taken, and GB Energy was a nod to his left. Couched in the language of public ownership, at the time the policy, and I guess still is, was never really properly defined. The other thing about that period, August 2022, is of course soaring energy bills that came along with it. We were staring down the barrel of energy bills doubling every few months. I think a third of Scots were going to be living in fuel poverty without the energy price guarantee being implemented, as it eventually was by the Tory government. We were even sort of tuning into telly on a Saturday morning and you'd see Phil Schofield and Holly Willoughby spinning a random wheel, and the caller would phone in and they would get to spin this wheel and they would win their energy bills paid for by Channel 4 for 3 months. So it was a deeply kind of dystopian time in the midst of the cost of living crisis, and I think it's easy to forget that. And that was the pressure that Labour were under, or the climate that GB Energy appeared in. It's also a time then when industrial policy, both in Britain and across the world, was back in vogue. We had Bidenomics in the States and this idea that we had to rebuild domestic manufacturing to move towards the energy transition across the West. And I suppose Starmer, in aligning himself with Biden and with the American Democratic Party, was seeking to emulate that. It was also very popular in Scotland, the SNP having just ditched their national energy company around the time that GB Energy was announced. I say the SNP ditched Scotland's national energy company, but it was Lon Slater, the Green Government Minister, who was assigned the task in Parliament of announcing that the Scottish National Energy Company was going to be shelved, where it remains. I think the important point to make tonight is that regardless of what GB Energy ultimately becomes, Labour have promised us in that manifesto that they will transition Britain to clean power by 2030. GB Energy is the main vehicle through which they want to deliver that promise. So we have a clear set of terms on which we can assess the viability and success of this policy. We can hold them, their feet to the fire on this policy very easily. And as I wanted it to lay out, it is absolutely set up to fail. There is very little chance that, as it's currently planned by Rachel Reeves with input from Ed Miliband and other energy ministers, that GB Energy alone will deliver that promise of clean power by 2030. So what do we actually know about GB Energy so far? Well, Labour Party have made a lot of noise about how it's going to be headquartered in Aberdeen. According to the King's Speech, GB Energy will own, manage and operate clean power projects. The question that we need to answer then is whether GB Energy will be based on genuine and substantive forms of public coordination, ownership or an investment, or whether it will amount to little more than a trivial, ineffective, de-risking venture that does nothing but subsidise private sector investment. The bill introduced in the House of Commons, the Great British Energy Bill, introduced by Michael Shanks, who's the Junior Energy Minister, offers no further detail on that commitment given in the King's Speech. It's one of the sort of most vague bills that you will read. No meat on the bone, as I said earlier. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the government has been allowed to persist for so long. We're talking 2 years ago that this policy was first announced without putting any meat on the bone of this policy. No one to hold them accountable, no one to challenge where the detail is coming from. What they have said, what we do know, is that over the course of this Parliament, over the course of the coming 4 or 5 years, GB Energy will be allotted £8.3 billion of new spending. £8.3 billion of new spending. Now, it sounds like a lot, but Labour, in February, we're going to give £28 billion every year for the Green Prosperity Plan. £28 billion every year. That's 140 billion over the course of this Parliament, reduced to less than 10% of that. 8.3 billion over the course of an entire Parliament to get Britain to a clean electricity grid by 2030. Now that 8.3 billion splits. The first 3 billion has been allotted to something called the Local Power Plan. Now that is a pot of money to which local government and communities can apply to construct green power, green renewable energy projects in their local area. And that is a net good. That is a good thing. Across the country, across Scotland, across Britain, across these islands, there are good examples of successful community energy. The Isle of Egg, which produces its own electricity, which is self-sufficient in North Ayrshire. Up until recently, the Labour Council was leading Britain, leading across the country on the development of community wealth building, and through that was able to transform former landfill sites into community-owned solar farms. That's a great success. That's what we need to be having across the country, and that £3 billion is a pot of money to which councils can apply to replicate those projects. That is a good thing. The second pot of money is where we might have more trouble. £5 billion is, from what I can tell, from what others can tell, has been allotted to make small investments in energy projects, primarily offshore wind, which the private sector has up until this point chosen not to take on because they are deemed too risky. So public subsidy, public cash is going to go to grease the wheels of capital in that sense. It's going to make these projects more appealing for already profitable private sector renewable giants to take on these projects primarily in the North Sea. Now, that's replicating the mistakes and problems that we all know exist in the energy market more broadly. That's socialising the losses just as we do in the private energy market just now. There's been a lot of comparisons to private finance initiatives made when it comes to GB Energy, the mechanism through which Blair and Brown built hospitals and schools across this country. But this is not PFI. It's actually worse than PFI, because in the case of PFI, eventually ownership of the school or hospital transfers to the government. These energy projects will never be owned by the state. They will remain in the hands of the private sector indefinitely. They will just have minimum shares taken on by the government via this £5 billion pot of money. So this is couched in the language of public ownership, couched in the language of a publicly owned energy company, but from what we can tell so far, is going to be used to entrench private ownership, to privatise effectively the just transition, to ensure our transition to renewables is run by the market. It's been compared, GB Energy, to national energy companies across Europe. But the reality is that the meagre level of investment assigned to the project, 8.3 billion over 5 years, I'll repeat it again because it really is staggering when you consider the amount of money Labour are threatening to give as recently as February. That meagre level of investment precludes it from GB Energy from ever being considered among the ranks of an Ørsted or Vattenfall European energy companies that they would so like to sit alongside. Jim Murphy, who I'm sure some of you will remember as the former leader of Scottish Labour who oversaw the collapse of Labour in Scotland in the 2015 general election, reduced to a rump 1 MP in actual fact. He said at a Labour Party conference fringe meeting 2 years ago, he said the Labour Party, the Labour government will be the first private sector government in history. And at the time it was difficult to tell what he meant because there was no detail in the manifesto. But this is what he was talking about. He was talking about state cash under the guise of public ownership being used to subsidise the private sector. After the election and the immediate aftermath of their landslide victory, Rachel Reeves' team briefed that Labour were going to commission BlackRock to rebuild Britain. So these are the things we're talking about while they rabbit on about supposed public ownership. In reality, it's nothing of the sort. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. They have guaranteed, promised us as one of their missions, this popular idea that government should set themselves missions and then accomplish them, or hopefully accomplish them. Set themselves a mission of clean power by 2030. But even if you talk to economists on the right of the Labour Party, if you talk to economists on the right of politics more generally, it's transparently clear that £8.3 million is not enough money to get to clean power. But £8.3 billion is not enough money to get to clean power by 2030. So on their own terms, given their own lack of ambition, they are failing. There's a claim made persistently by government ministers, challenged quite rightly by the SNP, that GB Energy will bring down bills. I think Labour promised around £1,400 off people's energy bills as a consequence of this policy. That idea comes from the fact that when the grid is eventually decarbonised, when we eventually reach clean power, energy will be cheaper to consume for us. But the reality is clean power is so far off that as long as we are not promising any more money than 8.3 billion, that GB Energy is very unlikely, in the short term at least, to take any money off any of our bills. 66% of the British public support the nationalisation of energy, from transmission right through to distribution to generation. The political will just is not there. They could change, nationalise the energy companies in a heartbeat if they wanted to. In fact, of the £96 billion that Unite estimate it would cost to nationalise energy assets right through from generation to us consuming it, of that 96 billion, we spent 26 billion sending money to the energy companies as part of Liz Truss's energy price guarantee that kind of placed a cap on the bills in 2022. So GB Energy could lower the cost of energy. It could provide certainty for us all, could provide certainty and industrial strategy, could insulate us against market shocks, and it could be a coherent, as I say, a coherent industrial strategy. But the political will is just not there. GB Energy could rebalance the British economy. If you look at the JERS figures from earlier in the year, the only two parts of this country's economy running in profit are London and the South East. Everywhere else running at a loss. That's just how dependent this country is on finance and services. GB Energy presents an opportunity to rebalance this economy, to spread wealth and power out from London and the South East through a just energy transition, and it's not being taken. That's criminal. What's even more criminal is that they are not telling us they're not doing it. They're waiting for someone to catch on, and for as long as that time, and until that point happens, they'll tell us nothing, apart from this 8.3 billion figure. What we do know is that GB Energy will begin operating the first sort of field of the transition which it's going to tackle is offshore, onshore wind. Now, Britain is a leader in offshore, onshore wind generation, but ranks 16th or 17th in the world when it comes to jobs in the supply chain. We just do not have green jobs to manufacture the components needed for the just transition. So we really need something like GB Energy. We really need a state vehicle to accelerate our transition, and the opportunity is being wasted. It's also important, I think, to note that there was very little offered to Scots by the Labour Party at the general election. There was no further offer on devolution. There was no talk of the devolution of employment law in the manifesto, despite the party having promised it in the past. All there was this commitment, ill-defined commitment to GB Energy, that apparently now is going to be headquartered in Aberdeen. So politically, GB Energy has to succeed for Labour in Scotland because it's not supported by additional commitments to people who live north of the border. As I say, the Scottish Government abandoned their own commitment to a national energy company. There's political capital available to the Labour Party to exploit. The Scottish Government's own green industrial strategy is just as vague and ill-defined as Labour's GB Energy plan. If you read the 54-page document, Matthew and I were talking about it earlier, that the Scottish Government just put out their green industrial strategy, which, by the way, was issued less than 24 hours before Petro Ineos announced the closures of Grangemouth. Great timing. It gives 5 industries that the Scottish Government define as central to the new economy post-energy transition. One of them is green financial services. So they are building a service economy dependent on cheap labour, dependent on the gig economy, with no serious industrial strategy. That 54-page document, by the way, the Scottish Government produced 24 hours before Grangemouth closed, mentioned trade unions once. If you look at the lobbying meetings that the Scottish Government took in the run-up to announcing that strategy, there were time for Shell, there was time for the North East lobbying firm Aberdeen, there was a whole host of meetings with Prosper, a whole host of meetings with other investment firms, but one meeting for the trade unions. So this isn't just a problem not just a problem with the Labour Party. The Scottish Government are in just as much of a mess, and that's nowhere clearer than the Scotland contracts. Scotland needs 18 manufacturing sites to honour the supply chain commitments of the Scotland contracts. We need 18. How many do we have just now? Zero. We have 0. The 2 sites that we hopefully will have in the coming months and years are run by Harland and Wolff, one in Fife, the other in the Western Isles. Harland and Wolff have just gone into administration. Who knows what's going to happen to that promise of 400 green jobs? We cannot understate how much of a mess decision makers north and south of the border are making of this just now. It's scandalous, and they're being let off the hook because they promise platitudes and vague terms, and no one is there to hold them accountable in either Parliament. For every £1 million of turnover that the renewable industry generates, just 2 green jobs are created. Renewables, just like the fossil fuel industry, is becoming a site of extraction in Scotland. Grangemouth is the best example of that failure. 2,000 green jobs gone, or 2,000 jobs dependent on the refinery gone. No promise yet to replace them with green ones. Moving to wrap up now, and there are positives that have positive soundbites from Labour Party politicians about what we might hope GB Energy does. The manifesto commits to investigating delinking the price of renewables from gas. Now, if that happens, it is a good thing, but investigating is not a promise. We'll see if it does. There are also things that, by the day, emerged that are not promising. For example, just yesterday, the UK government took GB Energy's website offline. Make of that what you will. You can't find GB Energy online. Already they're talking about leveraging £60 billion of private investment into GB Energy through Crown Estates. And they signed a partnership with Crown Estates in Scotland actually just just 2 weeks ago. At its core, the debate about GB Energy is a debate about who owns the economy. It's a debate about where power lies in our economy, and it's a debate about who owns our resources. Democratising the economy depends on the energy transition, and it depends on getting it right for the people who live here. GB Energy is a useful step in the right direction, but it is so far off the mark. I think as well it's important to note that we are not the only ones talking about it. Lobbyists are all over GB Energy, just as they are the rest of the Labour Party for that matter. A fifth of all climate events at Labour Party conference this year were sponsored by companies with links to the fossil fuel industry. I think 500 lobbyists paid £3,000 each for access to the Labour Party ministers at that conference in Liverpool. Everyone, it would seem, in the private sector wants a piece of GB Energy. Meanwhile, they will not tell the people they voted for them what it actually is. Of course, I think this, and I'll finish here, this is symptomatic of the broader political project of Starmer and his ministers, which is that they don't want popular engagement with their policy platform. They don't want people to know what they're doing because they're technocrats. And they don't like politics. Starmer in his New Year's address in January said something interesting. He said he wanted a politics which treads a little lighter on all of our lives. In other words, he wants to separate people from politics. He wants politics and the economy to exist in a separate sphere entirely to where the rest of us are. We don't bother with the economy because that's very complicated. We don't bother with the energy transition because that's very complicated. That is the project. And that's what GB Energy is all about. It's about not telling us a thing, but getting on with the job behind closed doors. When have you heard of a policy announced more than 2 years ago that we still know so little about, that was given such prominence in Labour's election manifesto, that the Scottish Labour politicians would roll out every time they were asked what the party was going to do, but fail to define what it was? There's a project here that goes beyond that too, and it's about abandoning what remains of the key tenets of social democracy. Mass membership in the Labour Party gone, wiped out through opposition to internal dissent and crackdown after crackdown on members who speak out, but it's not just internal. Universalism, a commitment to benefits for everyone, wiped in favour of means testing. We saw that with the winter fuel payment. Wealth creation and growth is the talk of Labour politicians, not wealth redistribution. Heaven forfend someone talks about wealth redistribution. Labour Party, who once believed the economy couldn't be left to the private sector, are now content to not leave it to the private sector, but to help the private sector, at least in the case of GB Energy. The point is that the Labour Party more and more rely on people turning away from politics. They rely on the alienation bred by politicians who promise change and don't deliver. The more people who turn away from politics, who bury their heads in the sand and say they're all the same, the happier Keir Starmer is, because there's less people paying attention to what's going on with GB Energy, less people paying attention to the number of lobbyists who they've let through the door to bite their ear off about the New Deal for working people, watered down time after time. They still call it the largest uplift in employment rights in a generation, and it is. But how many times has it been watered down from what it was? I think the point, though, and the point to finish on is that one about anti-politics. These people don't like politics. They don't like political discussion. They're a house of cards when they're challenged on something like GB Energy. I'll go back to the point that if you ask 3 separate Labour government ministers in 3 separate parts of the country what GB Energy is, you'll get 3 separate answers. Not one of them will be able to tell you. It's no wonder the public don't know anything about it, because they don't either. Thanks very much, folks.